In 1975, I was a 4-year Oleh Chadash in Israel. And I wrote a book on the proclamation of the state. It was financed by one of the Machons, and I gave an outline, and they okayed this outline, and then I began to work on this book. But I never published it. It was finished, but the Machon who was involved, for one reason or another, a package of reasons, did not want to publish it. After I handed in the first 80 pages, they saw that they couldn't publish it under their auspices, which means that you're getting paid for doing your own work, but nothing's going to come out of it from the point of view of publication under the auspices of this Machon. Okay, so I finished it up, more or less, but I never published it. Okay. I took what I called a truth approach to the document. What's that all about? It's 2 pages, it's hanging on the wall over there, it's 1 page, very short document compared to the Declaration of Independence, which is 5-6 pages, whatever. But I said, okay, the birth of Eretz Yisrael, the return to Eretz Yisrael, and the birth of the state is the biggest event and the most important event in Jewish history since the ancient time of the Beit HaMikdash and the origin of Chazal. Nobody disagrees with that. I was here 4 years in the country, a novice, and it was important to me to get some insight into the document. Oh, good! So this thing was available, I applied, I got it, I made an outline, fine. Great. Okay. So what's this thing all about? And what's the truth approach? So the document has a number of fundamental points. The state will be based on natural and historic right. Okay? And the story in the principal section, the state will be based on liberty, justice, and peace as understood by the prophets. After that, it talks about equality. But equality is not included in that threesome under the prophets, probably because the prophets were, at least it's hard to say and cut up the prophets in such a way that equality was fundamental when Yisrael was the chosen people, and this was a big motif in the prophetic world. And so probably the case was they didn't want to do anything. The founding fathers didn't want to have too much disagreement on equality as one of these principles. But indeed, the state will be based on equality before the law, and so forth. But just to point out that the term equality, the concept of equality, was not included in the triad. Okay, so what did I do? The most important thing is the birth of Medinat Yisrael. Here's the document. What's it got to do with Torah? What's it got to do with Jewishness? So I said, got a fantastic idea. I'm going to postulate an underlying meaning and a surface meaning. The surface meaning is what I just read. The state will be based on natural right, historic right, freedom, justice, peace understood by the prophets. But the underlying meaning will be what they said, as understood by the prophets. What was the prophet's conception of freedom? What was the prophet's conception of justice? What was the prophet's conception of peace? And where is it in the document? So I said, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to take a representative from Western civilization, from Western philosophy, on each of the fundamental concepts: natural right, historic right, freedom, justice, peace. Okay? I'm going to upgrade what these terms mean by taking a number of philosophers who dealt with this. I took John Stuart Mill, whose book on liberty is a classic, And I took John Stuart Mill on freedom. I took John Rawls, who wrote a book on justice as fairness. When I came to Boston, he was just coming into Harvard there, but the book was just coming out. It made a big hit. Still now, it's a big hit. It's the classic work in political philosophy in terms of not the Declaration, but the whole concept of justice. He called it justice as fairness. And I took Immanuel Kant, who wrote on a book called Perpetual Peace, and in there he dealt with internationalism and the whole problem of international peace. So I took these three thinkers, I wrote them up, and then I said, oh, I'm now going to give you a Torah critique of these guys. And that will be the Jewishness or the Torah aspect of this document. Fantastic. Okay? So, that's what I started to do. So the first point is, this paper, this book outline, had a subtitle. It was called On the Proclamation of the State of Israel, and the subtitle was Life, Mind, and Time. This is 1975. Life, Mind, and Time. Good. So a few years ago, which we'll come to soon, I decided to publish this book. The time seemed propitious to publish the book. So I looked through my junk, and there it was, the typewritten, one-finger typewritten copy that I made at the time. And what did I discover? Right there in front of me, when I took the typewritten sheets, you know, because then I whatever was missing, I got my scanner, and I would scan it in, and then I'd fix it up and go to town. So what do I see? The title of the proposal, the title of the thing on the front page was Life, Mind, and Time. The subtitle was On the Proclamation of Independence of Medina Yisrael. I was under the impression all the years that the title was the title, the proclamation, that's what we're going to talk about, and the subtitle was a way of capturing in a simple way a big aspect of the Torah understanding. Okay. So now I asked myself, where did that come into the picture? When I started to make the outline for this new piece, which was 35 years afterward, I didn't have any subtitle. I just wrote on the proclamation. That's the title. Now I'm going to write about it. Okay, we're going to come to that later. But interestingly enough, we saw a very interesting switch of the title and the subtitle. Okay. Further, I said to you, the state will be based on natural and historic right as understood by the prophets. What does it say? What does it say?
Freedom, justice, and peace.
What? Next.
Or after that. Next, it will ensure...
No, freedom, justice, and peace.
As envisaged by the prophets of Israel.
Envisioned!
Yeah.
It does not say as understood. Yeah. It says as envisioned by the prophets. Envision means messianism. The document, of course, at that time in 1948, with the whole world situation and everything else, messianism had much more punch than it does today. After we want Moshiach now, and so on and so on. But the point was, it didn't say understood, it said as visualized by the prophet.
What was the Hebrew word?
Whatever. The point is, the translation is correct, and for a number of months working on the thing, I used to be next to Steinsaltz. My office in Van Lee was next to Steinsaltz when I was using their library, so I would see him sometimes, you know. But basically, it says as visualized, envisioned. The point was that I, as I said beginning of this whole thing, which we're going to talk in more detail, I entered the document from the point of view of truth. What is the core set of truths that's being done? So I postulated the outside meaning. I'm going to give you the inside meaning, but the overall orientation was a truth orientation, which then justified the existence of the state. So I entered the document as a truth, with a truth perspective, and so a Freudian slip, I said understood. Because, what do you mean? I was interested in what the Novi had to say and how I'm going to critique it, or how I'm going to fit it into the document such that it brings forth the Jewishness or the Judaism in the document. That was the goal. So unawares to anything else, it was a Freudian slip, like it was a Freudian slip on the subtitle. There was a slip on the word, and I used the word understood, as understood by the prophets, for a number of months. And in one conversation that I had with some guy there, or whatever it was, he said, no, it doesn't say that. You're lousy Hebrew, but it says that's envisioned by the prophets. So you can understand right away, from the point of view of what the document and the importance and so on and so on, the Messianism was a point in Israel's in the favor of establishing the state. The promise, the Jews kept it alive for the centuries, and so on and so on. Some of that history is given in the document. Okay. So, as I said before, after I handed in the first 80 pages, they turned it down. So I thought, well, they turned it down. I divided the signers into 4 groups, 2 religious and 2 non-religious. I organized the introduction around the motif of Chaverim Kol Yisrael. All Jewry is embodied in this document. The state is not just for people who are going to live here. The state is for all Jews, especially those who are going to make Aliyah and live here in their lives. Okay. So, there's a Jewishness that I'm going to tell and so on. But they turned it down. Okay. So why did they turn it down? Well, I had a critique of Marx in the introduction about how to write history, and a quote from Hegel. And I quote Avenari, who was his book on Marx and Hegel, wrote 2 books, one on Marx, one on Hegel. They're, to me, the best I ever read on Marx and Hegel, aside from themselves. You know, the early Marx was fantastic. You could say, by the way, you could understand when you read the early Marx, before Engels and before the economic Das Kapital and the whole rest of the system, the German dialectical with Engels and so on. But when you look at the early Marx, and they have some publications which, you know, put together early Marx writing, it's the music is Jewish. The music is what we say Toradic. The music is, so you can understand how many people of that generation were socialists. I don't have to be communist, but were socialists because it was a Jewish flavor. I mean, if you read it, it's there. It just jumps out at you, the whole picture. So in the introduction, I wrote a little piece, a little couple of paragraphs on Marx. I stressed Chaverim Kol Yisrael, the religious and the non-religious, the right and the left, and I tried to start with a unity and not with a fragmentation or a polarization. So I started that way, and I said I'm going to deal with Marx and with this Chaverim Kol Yisrael, and for whatever reasons, somewhat political, whatever the reason was, they didn't accept the piece. Okay. So I thought, well, they didn't accept it because this particular machon in Tel Aviv, whatever, this particular machon had a left orientation, and here's some crazy guy going to write on the proclamation, and he's going to put the left in its proper place as not being the core of the document, even though Ben Gurion and some of the others who wrote it, 57, 37, whatever, who compiled the document. Ben Gurion was the leader. But these people were basically the old timers and the old people who established the Medina, many of whom were obviously from Europe and from socialist orientation. Okay, so I took it for granted that the basic reason, among others, as I said, there was some politics, it's not important, but the basic reason was that it didn't fit the orientation, the political orientation of the people funding the project. Now, when I started to redo or to start over again 35 years later and write another book or take the old manuscript and re-edit it and bring it up to date to polish it up, so when I started to do that, so I realized, and you'll hear right away, I had a new approach, and we'll get to this idea of ideational teshuva. I had a new approach to the document, and that new approach, which we'll talk about in some detail today, that new approach threw off a realization that I never realized before. They didn't turn it down because it was a political thing and they couldn't publish it and so on. They never told me why. That's something else. But they didn't publish it because of that. They didn't publish it because in the introduction, which was 12 pages, there was the concept of conceptual unity. I'm going to deal with a conceptual unity under the document, so I took the time to spell out what that is. In the process, there was a critique of Descartes. Okay? There were 7 philosophers mentioned in that introduction in 12 pages. They didn't turn it down because it was left. They turned it down because they said, this guy is nuts. What the hell is on the expression? What is it? What is Descartes, Sartre, this one, Spinoza, what have they got to do with the Proclamation? We're paying this guy to write a book on the Proclamation. What is these philosophers? They didn't understand. They probably never read Descartes. They never understood what he was talking about. And some guy comes along and he writes a piece on what is a conceptual unity. Because I'm going to present a conceptual unity. So I said, what is it? And so it dawned on me from the new perspective 35 years later, as just an aside, I've been going under the assumption all these years, 35 years is a long time, I've been going on the assumption that it was turned down because of a political orientation and not due to a straightforward thing. They say, look, what does this have to do with the Proclamation? And furthermore, what did you write? You wrote Life, Mind, and Time is the title of the work. You're not interested in the Proclamation. You're interested in life, mind, and time. You're interested in the nature of time, the life system, all the things that developed later, 35 years later, and where we are today, where I am today. All of those ideas, especially life, energy, and so on, this whole picture, which is the new understanding that came with this whole development, all of a sudden, they said, look, you the title of your book, see what you wrote in the typewritten copy, which I didn't believe. You're interested in life, mind, and time, and taking the occasion of working on the document as a way of getting support, financial support, for working on your own stuff. Why couldn't that be the scenario that they turned it down? They turned it down not on politics, but they said, what's the shaykhs of Bachas? What does it have to do? What does it have to do with the Proclamation? I thought the guy is writing something on the Proclamation. So that dawned on me as much more reasonable assumption why they turned it down. Okay? And of course, they weren't interested to finance, nobody was going to finance at that time even, work or research on life, mind, and time. They didn't even know what we're talking about, that there was another plane instead of the mind-body. I was still in mind-body. You could see it from the whole business. I was in Descartes and so on. But you see the mind, life, mind, body. But it was there. The thing was the dualism of mind-body from Descartes, and that was all modern philosophy. And so I added life on the top. In Hebrew is chaya, neshama, guf. Life, neshama, guf. So, and when I called the liphonic physics, had these three components, and so on, so on, so on, that we're familiar with from what I talk about. But here we see a realization of a point that I never even went into my head, that they did it this way. Okay. So, I said like this, I entered with a truth perspective. Now look, there were 37 people, educated people. Okay. Natural right, historic right. Well, okay. They have a general understanding what that means. Historical right was biblical right. God promised to the Jewish people the land of Canaan and so on, and from there we have a tradition and so on and so on, and historic right was linked up with biblical right. The right from the Bible, we get this view. And natural right came as the modernization of natural law. That the famous distinction in the Greeks was by nature and by convention. And so by nature, anything that was by nature had a higher metaphysical status, and the virtues and the whole orientation to knowledge was by nature. And something that was by nature, when it came to society and politics and so forth, by nature, something that was by nature had an intrinsic value, and something that was by convention was amenable to change. They had dealt with the idea of change and unchanged. So nature fixed, unchanged. So something that's based on nature, virtues, natural laws, on. If you have a concept of freedom and it's built on nature, it stands higher in the understanding package and the reason and the rationality than it does by convention. Like you get together and you agree to have freedom, that's by nature, because today you agreed and tomorrow that's by convention. Today you agreed and tomorrow events change and shift, and all of a sudden what your concept of freedom was here has shifted into something that looks very much like totalitarianism. I mean, convention means change, open to change of the view. Okay, so they oriented the gotta watch when I go off the track. Okay, so there was this historic right, natural right, but more important, liberty, justice, and peace is understood by the prophets. Did they do any homework? Go to the prophets? One would think, you just said, we're going to put this line in, for whatever the reasons. I'm not interested in the siksuchim that went on in the thing, but we're putting this line in. Well, I asked you off the cuff, what was the prophet's conception of freedom? What was the prophet's conception of peace? What was the prophet's conception of justice? They wrote it. They didn't do any homework. They relied on the common sense meanings of the three words, and indeed, it was a document. I made it into a truth document, that it was conveying truths. So I built up the concepts and then refuted them from the truth point of view. To refute John Stuart Mill, from a Torah point of view, gave an insight into the Torah side and into the John Stuart Mill side. But this was argument, this was ideas, this was a truth orientation. They looked at it like it's a political document, a document of the founding. And so they didn't do any homework. They relied on their common sense meanings of freedom, justice, natural right, historic right, and so on. Okay? So I came along and said, well, you didn't do your homework? I'm going to do your homework. And I'm going to do like I just spoke about before. I'm going to build up the concepts by Western thinkers and then argue against them from a Torah point of view and show how this is implicit in the document. So this was the business. From the new approach that I started to go to, I asked myself the question, did I study the prophets? I didn't look at the prophets. I went back, I took my memory, and I said, I didn't look at the prophets. Didn't open the book. Didn't open one Navi. What did I do? What did I do? They relied on freedom, justice, and peace in the common sense word in the dictionary, one-liners. And I relied on life, mind, and time. I didn't look up freedom, justice, and peace because my interest was not that. My interest was not the document. The document was the takeoff, an occasion to do something else. So I didn't do any homework either. Life works funny. Intellect. Had I done the homework in 1975, it could be that I would have discovered something we'll talk about later, about Moshe Rabbeinu's difference from the prophets, and the whole orientation that I built on of splitting off Moshe from the prophets and showing that the prophets theologized the system, and Moshe Rabbeinu was left with a system that didn't come down to us in any way. What came down to us was the prophetic version that was written up properly in the 8th century BCE in the king prophets period, and the prophets is what we inherited. Okay, so I realized that here was this document, and I didn't do any homework either. And had I done the homework, it's possible. I don't say necessary. I still learned a lot in 35 years. But it's possible in 1975 I would have hit upon the ideas and would have developed that whole thing 35 years before. I leave that open. But now what we have is, from the new entry, which we'll talk about right away, from the new entry into the document, things came out that were taken for granted, never even entered consciousness. They were just taken for granted as part of the reality picture. And what I showed and realized, that's not true. There's a whole other scenario here that makes much more sense as to why the thing was turned out. Okay. So they didn't do their homework. I didn't do the homework either. Interesting. I decided to publish this book again. Okay. In 1975, I called myself a Torah person. That's the way I refer to myself. But a Torah person did not hold the view that God is a principle of explanation or justification. This came from all the years in philosophy where when you're trying to explain or justify something, there has to be more clarity in terms of the stuff that you're using to explain than what you're explaining. You have to have some material in the explanation package or in the justification package that gives the basis of the subject that you're going to talk about. Now, in God, at that time in 1975, after a lot of time spent on this whole issue, I didn't have anything except unknowability. So I realized that I really don't hold this idea that God runs the universe, or does this, or does that, or it has to do with hashgacha, and so on, and so that God is a principle of explanation or justification. So fine. So to make way for who I was, coming from abroad and so on in the States, and I met people, and I had the Chabad, and so I said, well, I'm a Torah. I didn't use that dati language. It was out of my vocabulary then, because, dati, chiloni, the Hebrew terms. So I said, I'm a Torah person, but I don't hold this thing. I do the mitzvah, and built on halacha, and so on and so on. But I don't hold that. Okay. In 35 years, I changed. And we'll see exactly where the change is and how it came about. I still call myself a Torah person, but with the addition, somehow along the line, who solved the God existence problem. I went into philosophy exclusively for the God existence problem. I was in the Jewish fold. I never got good answers in the house. Why I couldn't listen to the Lone Ranger Friday night on 7:30 when it got dark, and why Shabbos afternoon the Metropolitan had operas the Met, fantastic pieces, WNYC. I never got good answers. Okay. I didn't go to a yeshiva because in those years they were fearful about bilingualism. I didn't know Yiddish. My mother didn't know Yiddish, my father knew Yiddish, and so they didn't speak it in the house. I didn't know Yiddish, so they didn't take me in the yeshiva. I applied for Torah V'das, they didn't take me there. So I came up through the public school system. Okay. But I went into philosophy, aside from all the biography, which is some of it will come up later, but a lot of it is very interesting as you look back on your biography. You got unbelievable things. But when you put it all together, I kept the label, but I added something. For me, I said, I solved the problem. Namely, I didn't find any proofs. I studied proofs for God's existence. I studied the literature. I studied the whole of philosophy, which could, from one point of view, be looked upon either you're for God or against God, for religion or against religion. That was philosophy, as we went and looked through the systems. And with a tremendous education in philosophy, at 7 universities and so on, I got a fantastic philosophical education, but came up empty-handed when it came to the God issue, is what I went into. Indeed, it lasted so long that in 1965, when I wrote my dissertation and got the doctorate, a guy asked me, he says, why'd you pick Whitehead? I picked Whitehead to write a doctorate on Whitehead. He's a very, very difficult philosopher. And a lot of people ran away, 20th century thinker, wrote with Bertrand Russell, with Principia Mathematica, and so on. As a matter of fact, my Kabbalah teacher, Shalom Slutskin, he studied with him in England, and he took his math course. He used to teach math, and he said, look, you're giving it on Shabbat, I can't come. So Whitehead said, look, don't come, just take the notes from somebody and take the exam. So I learned at least one little tidbit about Whitehead, that he was a real Adin, guy. And incidentally, over the years in academia, I met numerous people, Catholic and Protestant, who were beautiful people, were Adin people with intellect, with understanding. And we had very interesting discussions over the years, either faculty or students, that because when you're in the big world, unlike some of the kids, they're in a very narrow shtetl world. But in the big world of academia, in the States and at the universities, you meet people and professors who have these qualities. Okay, so that issue lasted until 1965. I wrote my master's thesis in 1954. But the whole God concern lasted until the dissertation, because I took Whitehead because he was a 20th century thinker. He built on relativity, okay? He summed up the philosophy, for him, the history of philosophy is a footnote to Plato and so on. And Whitehead had a God concept. And so even at this later time as 1965, when I was already in philosophy for so many years, at least 10 years, 10, 15 years, as a student and teaching. And so here's Whitehead, who has a God concept. So the guy asked me, why'd you pick him? He's so difficult. Process and reality, and he had his own technical language, terms that have a single quote. And though that you got to work. You got to work hard to understand what a guy's talking about. Fine. So I wrote a dissertation on Whitehead, but I'm only showing you now. The point was that the God issue was still dominant. Of course, I came up empty-handed again, and so I had nothing to show except a fantastic education, but nothing to show from the point of view of the solution to the problem. There wasn't a proof. I found, when I started to rewrite this whole business, I found that it's not a question of proof of God's existence. It's a question of how do you get a framework where an unknowable plays some functional role in the picture. So you're not entering from the point of view of truth, you're entering from the point of view of meaningfulness. And indeed, at least it opens up, gives you a wider frame to deal with the problem. You were concerned that the problem was triggered off by identity. The problem was triggered off was Joe Levinson, who liked to play ball and had to go around the corner on Shabbat and go away so nobody should see you throwing a ball, bouncing it up and down or off the stoop. Well, it was identity. The problem was identity. And the God problem was the crystallization of that in the mind. But the identity was a full range of identity in terms of feelings, how you relate to other people, and so on, so on, so on. So this was the whole, the whole picture. So I went in and I discovered that, for whatever it is, from the truth perspective, I can't say anything. Because there's no proofs, there's no evidence, there's no way of having the explanation package being clearer than what it's explaining. And so I discovered, you don't need it. You don't need it. That was the discovery and the solution. So what's interesting is that when I said, oh, I'm a Torah person, and I said it then, it was in the truth context. When I said it now, 35 years later, it was in the context of meaning, and in the context of saying, I'm a Torah person who got something positive to say. Before I said, I'm a Torah person who does not believe in God as a principle of explanation and justification. The negative. Here, I got something positive. I got a positive dimension to that statement. I'm a Torah person. Namely, solve the problem. What did I do? And that's all the work that I've done in the last number of years, is to show that the system of Torah does not require a belief in God. And that's what I showed. I'm going to come back to that right away. But the basic point was a shift in understanding away from truth, when it came up dead end, into a different approach which looks at the problem in a big different way. How that is, we're going to talk about right away. Okay, so here you see something lasted all those years and finally was put to rest by the breakthrough that involved this new picture. Just to read, we'll get it right away. I wrote 2 books a few years ago on this topic, and there's another one and another 2 on this topic. They're ready to go. I wrote on this topic, and just to read you the back end of the back page, okay. It's called The Secret Silence of Moses. And it said in the back, this world historic book at long last gives voice to Moses' silence. The result is a new way of experiencing the biblical text, not as a book about God in the language of man, but about man in the language of God. In a nutshell, that's what was discovered. Chazal said that we talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the language of man, and I took that to be a hint of something the opposite. That we talk about man in the language of God. Namely, in the 2 fundamental terms for God's existence in the Chumash, which is Hashem and Elohim. And so, with that shift, because if you think about it, and you formulate, what does it mean to talk about Hashem in the language of man? Well, if you didn't know we were talking about Hashem, you'd think we're talking about man. So it turns out that hidden in their principle is the opposite. So I'm going to write straight. I'm going to write straight about man. But I'm going to use the language of God in the text. And so I made a differentiation between the text and icon, like on your computer. The terms Hashem and Elohim in the text are not part of the discourse language. They are instructions to the reader, namely, to shift the referent from God to man. That was the basic move in the argumentation. And then I wrote these 2 books to try to show and prove or give material to build that up and show you this whole picture. We'll come to it soon, in a different way. But this was the solution and gave something positive. When you have something positive and not merely from the negative, you have a different power. You have a different way of writing. You have more self-assertion because you've got something to say that's positive. You're not just saying what you don't hold. You have something, what you do. As a matter of fact, I argued many, many years with the Rav and others about whether or not in logic negation presupposes affirmation. If there is nothing, what are you negating? Well, in modern logic, as you probably know, it does not presuppose affirmation. That's a metaphysical point. In the modern conception of logic and symbolic logic, these are operators. And you can have a negation operator and an affirmation operator, or function, however you want to call it. And they do not presuppose anything more than the logical notation, the special notation, and they're on the same level. So it does not, it never satisfied me, and still, every time I have a pang that says, there must be something out there. There must be something that gives credence to this basic idea, that there has to be something before you negate it. You know, you say there is X. Oh, X is something. Then you say not X. Well, X is still there. So why is not X and X on the same plane? They're operators. Okay, they're functions. So it does not, against common sense, it doesn't presuppose. However, okay, this was the orientation. So when I wrote on this thing, on this book, I took one basic point was to differentiate between an icon and the language, the word, or whatever you're using. The icon on your thing which says press word is not part of word. It tells you to, I'm going to give you word now, and then you can start to type up the situation. So I built a Perush and other materials on the idea of taking God out and putting man in, but in the name, in the language of Hashem and Elohim. And then I discussed and constructed and developed the text in such a way that I interpreted every place where it says Hashem and Elohim. Nobody did it. And all the great Meforshim in our great tradition, nobody took the trouble to do everything. They did quick. The Ramban and others said, oh yes, when it says Hashem, we're talking about Rachman. When it says Elohim, we're talking about Din. And the Gemara built up these things. But they gave a number of examples, and that's fine. What do I have to tell you 1,000,000 times? I tell you what the story is. Okay, you got it. Once you get the point, you do it yourself. I mean, if they said that's the principle, that Elohim is Din and Hashem is Rachman, when you see Elohim in a piece, so your head should right away go and get help from Chazal saying, where's the Elohim dimension and what does that mean? Okay, Elohim, as you know, means Das Tovara, defined in the text in the Gan Eden story. It says you'll be like Elohim, Yodea Tovara, judgment, Din, and a family of meanings that go with it are Elohim. And in Chumash way of orientation, if you study or if you relate to Elohim, you're relating to the judgment of Din. If you relate to Hashem, you're relating to Eitz HaChaim. And that's where we get this emphasis on life energy or life from the text itself. So what we're saying, when the text uses Elohim, in this orientation, we're talking about that aspect of the human being which can fall reasonably under the framework, under the category of Din. And when we talk about Hashem, we're talking about things that fall under the category of Rachamim. Now, I mean, as an aside, which you heard before, but it's worth repeating, Chazal knew. It says Eitz HaChaim, it doesn't say Eitz HaRachman. So we have to understand, it's not for now, but we have to understand at some point what did Chazal do in their help, trying to give you a guidance. So they emphasize Rachmim, but it's coming, they saw the same thing I saw. It's coming from the Eitz Chaim. And sure, Rachmim is a subset underneath Chaim. Just like order, structuration is a subset underneath Elohim. And so what goes with this whole new approach, which we'll finish with tonight, we're going to go on to the rest of the story here, but the point was, you open up the text by seeing that there's a family of meanings underneath each usage. Using Hashem, there's a family of meanings. So it could mean general feeling, as distinct from understanding. It could mean rachmim, like they say. It could mean giving birth in a certain respect. It could mean being helped. A soldier's going out to war and he needs chizuk and so forth. It comes in from Chaim. In other words, underneath each category is a set of different meanings. Well, one reason the Mefarshim didn't do it was they didn't look at it this way. So it says, Hashem means Rachmim. Okay. Well, I say Hashem means Chaim, and when you look and do it, as I did, you find insights galore in the text where it's not limited to Rachmim, it's including and starting to spread to all dimensions of the human being. And so this was the picture. So one of the reasons they didn't do it was because it was simple and they didn't take the trouble to do it. When I took the trouble to do it, you get a fantastic insight. So much so that it took up 950 pages to write up every place it said Hashem, every place it said Elohim. There's 250, 300 places where it says Elohim, and I don't know, 900 or something like this, or 1,000 places, 1,200 where it says Hashem. And so I took the trouble to do each one, and then you get this picture that blossoms forth. Okay, some other time we'll talk about that in more detail. But this was the point. So, I had now something positive to say. And this changes your whole orientation to everything because you're coming out of a base that has explanatory power, justification power for the intellect, and also enters into the rest of the human being, the action world, feeling world, because you've now widened up the perspective away from a truth approach is what I entered in terms of the document. So, I decided to write this thing. And as the thing developed, as the writing developed, I got a crazy idea. Instead of rewriting the document, or discarding the document that was written, which was, I don't know, 200 pages, something like this, I would keep it and put next to it in the same book the new approach, and point out and show the reader the differences, the significant differences in the two different accounts. So they would have the two pieces, they would see the differences, and they would now appreciate more from where those differences come. So the general answer is, what does that mean to say? What does it mean to say, I called myself a Torah person with this positive dimension, that a Torah person who solved the problem of God's existence and His word. Okay, what does that mean? So as you know, I'm big on the performative, and there is such a thing, and it's all over the psychological literature in terms of identity, that a person has identification, identifies himself, and is identified by others psychologically by virtue of self-bestowed performative. When I say I am a Torah person, that's not true or false. That's a declaration. A declaration is a performative. To declare is to say, I declare. That's what a performative. When you to get married, to have the performative is to say the words. Harayat, and so on. You say the words, and the words are the performative, which then have consequences and so on. it has the conditions. If you're a boy at the age of 3 and you say that, doesn't mean anything. You have to have conditions and consequences and the legal status. That's called the performative. Every legal system has performatives and is built on the fundamental of performatives. So I say, and I generalize that, instead of saying limiting it to legal system, I said that in effect, the way to define the society, the ordinary world in which we live, the ordinary world, not the scientific world, the ordinary world, in order to define what that is, we said the world of experience. That was Dewey's term. It's the world of experience, the world of the human being. So it's not the world of things, it's the world of how the human being relates to things. It's all the human being as the center, the core of the notion of experience. And nature is something else. For me, it has to be constructed and this and that and so on and so on. But there is the ordinary world. The ordinary world is a world which I said includes legal performatives, mores, customs that came down in the society and so forth, and also self-referential performance. Namely, the person calls himself by this. That's a performative. And so what we would see now is the power of, and what happened all along the way, I'm going to talk about that, how the shift in the meaning of the performative was the new orientation. The new orientation was not a truth orientation. And I'll show it to you right away. But the basic idea the whole thing is being carried by self-referential performatives. A performative that one bestows on oneself. Example, conversation. In conversation of any type, in conversation you will see, listen to, pick one, anyone random off the street, any conversation on any topic, you will see that in a 25-minute conversation, somewhere along the line, there will be a declaration by the person. You know who you're talking to? You're talking to a ball player. You're talking to, I won the Israeli prize. In conversation, because it's so rich and so full of shifts from assertion statements, which are true or false, which trigger off a discussion of whether it's right or wrong, true or false, good or bad, beautiful or ugly. On the other hand, other statements which don't do that, asking advice, giving advice. Why are you going to the movies tonight? Oh, well, I want to do it. It's a great picture. Oh, yeah, but you shouldn't do that. It's Friday night. We don't usually go on Shabbat. So there's advice giving and so on, and there's commands, tzivuis, there's commands, do this, it'll be good for you. There's advice giving, and indeed there's assertions, and there is, as you'll see in a piece of conversation, you'll listen to it, you'll see there are indications of who is the talker, who is this guy. You just met the person. When you introduce him, you say hello. Hello is a performative. My name is, and you give your name. So you go around a group and you say, my name is this. Well, naming is to say, my name is. I mean, that's the performative. That's what we're talking about here. So, the new approach to the document entered the document from the point of view of the performative, and more substantively from the point of view of life and life energy as being what the founding fathers were talking about. They made a big mistake. Because they didn't investigate it, they took for granted what these things meant, and they did not come on to what I can call an anthropology of Moshe Rabbeinu time. An anthropology of the way society worked. What were the principles? And so when you do that, and you enter the document or enter the culture from the point of view of what an anthropologist writing a description of the culture, it turns out that the whole conception of language in the biblical world was performative. As indicated in the Bereshit story, when it says Hashem Elohim created the world, and he says, Yehi Or, Vayihi Or. we're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're talking about Elohim. But the formula, Yehi, is the fundamental formula of a performative. Let there be, let me be, and so that's the performative. And in the first story after the Migdal Bavel story, we had before that, when we have Adam Rishon coming to the before in the Gan Eden story, looking for Chava, Ezer Kenegdo, and so on. So right there, the text indicates a thing is what it's taken to be. It's not coming in from an approach that's talking about reality, that's talking about things. It's talking about how the person relates, experiences, relates to the thing. In different terms, when we read anthropologically, everything was human soaked and everything was life energy soaked. So a stone could have life energy in it. When Queen Elizabeth came to my house and she sat on that chair over there, well, that chair took on properties from the existence that the Queen came here and sat on that chair. That's not the same chair as it was before she did that. In other words, in the ordinary world of experience, oh yeah, there's a big difference. That chair's worth $1,000. Before she sat on it, it ain't worth nothing. So in society, you can make a lot of money. But in existence terms, we have to formulate what that would be. Existence terms, well, then a chair is a chair is a chair. So that certain properties become significant and other properties are not significant. I'm not going to get into any of that tonight, but as you know, I developed and I generalized this notion of the performative to let it do conceptual work in communicating or getting across the society. And so I said, oh, you didn't do your homework. Now I'm going to do your homework on a new document. So instead of taking representatives in Western civilization and showing that there's a critique of them by the Torah system, I said, forget it. Let laying dogs lay. Let them be there. Let it be in the book. We'll answer the question right away why I want it in. We can throw it out altogether. If nobody would read it then, nobody will read it now. Did the guy read Descartes? He wants to read a book. You have a nice cover that says the Proclamation. He'll look something in Descartes, Spinoza, the same reaction that was done in 1975 by the committee would be done by the guy who says, what the hell, I don't want this book. Look at it, there's 75 pages on. So there's a question which we'll come to at the end. Why I'm including it as an option to put it in. You could just throw it away and forget it, and as I did in the thing. So what did I do? I went to what for me was the big guy in the anthropology of the Bible, which was Johannes Pedersen, a Danish guy who wrote Israel, Its Life and Culture in 1926. And this was he led the way in scholarship on Torah, on the Bible, the biblical world. He led the way. It was the fundamental book in all the Protestant seminaries. I went to Union Theological Seminary to study Old Testament, what they call Old Testament, see how they handle it and so forth. I sat there with a kippah and got all kinds of questions. I was a representative. I was an Amaharit. What do I know about Judaism? But they used to come to me and say, what does this word mean? What does that word mean? I said, look, I said, tell you the truth, I'm just a beginner. I don't know much. Okay. But I met a lot of interesting guys. But in the Protestant seminary, of course, he's from Columbia, Union Theological, Pedersen, Israel's Life and Culture was the thing. And when I found the book, it was a burnt edition. It had like a charring. And I found the book for $25, 2 volumes. Whoa! I'll never forget, I called my friends and we had a little party. You couldn't get the book. I mean, it was in the library. I like to mock up the book. Okay. It's not even up for sale. The rest of my book's up for sale, but this one is such a fantastic piece. And I've read it so many times over the years. And I found him to be the best piece, best book. Now it's in 2 volumes and so on, but the 2 volumes I have, and who dealt with the nature of a name, the nature of kavod, the nature of the Brit, of the covenant, and so on, the nature of shalom, the nature of justice, of tzedek, the nature of freedom, and so on. So with the help of Pedersen, I now went and did the homework. I went to the prophets, and to Moshe Rabbeinu, and back on my Perush, and so on, and I wrote, oh yes, the state will be based on natural right. That's out. That's been since the middle of the 18th, 19th century. Rousseau was a Christ of natural right. That's not a viable concept today. I dealt with Hegel, who had what we called rational right, and I had a big piece on Hegel to discuss his conception of it was good, it was not adequate. But the problem of biblical right was a little tricky, to say the least. Why? Because biblical right in the first document, the first manuscript, was refuted by Spinoza. Spinoza said biblical right is a form of convention. It's by convention. Our God says, we gave the land. Quran said, well, God took it away from you and gave it to us even though we were never here before. I mean, that's convention. Never mind the substance. I'm not interested in that for the moment. But the point is, that's convention. So in the first piece of 1975, I dealt with historic right. I dealt with natural right. I showed that it's not applicable. Then I dealt with historic right. And in the historic right piece, I took Spinoza as an example of a critique of historic right when it meant by convention.
Biblical right.
Biblical right. Biblical right. Right. Historic right means biblical right. And that's a form of convention, and therefore it has a lower status in the picture, and you can't really build an ethic, a politic, an orientation to life on that. You have to have something that was by nature, that gave it the power, the conceptual power. Okay, so now we took Spinoza, used him as he criticized the Rambam as a classical Jewish thinker, and he wrote, they call him the first biblical critic, you talk about 17th century, and he wrote in his book on theological politicus, and so on, he wrote on the topic of the Bible and how he looked at it and so on and so on, and how he refuted it by his philosophy, which was a metaphysical philosophy on a modern keel built on Descartes and differentiated from Descartes. He wrote a number of books on Descartes, and Spinoza, for years, has been the locus of the refutation of biblical, anything that has an authority of the Bible. Spinoza refuted that, and it's viable till today. And one of the first papers I wrote when I went into philosophy, one of them was Darwin. I went to the library, took out The Descent of Man, and then Origin of Species. My first term paper was on Darwin. And the second paper was on Spinoza, and over the years, Spinoza was a thorn in my side because I could never refute Spinoza on a rational base. I could refute him on a faith base, on a Torah base. We hold this, and we make a lot of meaning out of it, and we develop a whole system. But it's not rational in the sense that it's not built on nature. HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Spinoza was not the way we understood it. It had to do with the metaphysic of extent, substance, and so on. It was a metaphysical picture. Okay. So what did I do? In the second version, I went to the text with the help of Pedersen, and I wrote a number of pages on freedom, justice, and shalom. I don't even use the word peace because what's come down, like in Kant, who was the writer that I used to critique, he was dealing with peace in the sense of international relations, of no war. And that's, in effect, what the Founding Fathers meant. They meant peace in the usual sense, that there's no war. That's what it means. And everybody knew it, so they didn't do their homework. And I didn't bring back the old teaching, I just left it be. Even Kant, in that time, writing in 1790, whatever it was, he talks about a war always increases the national debt, a problem that we live with in the contemporary world. So he had some insights into Kant was used as the basis of the League of Nations, and some of the Kant was used as international law. This was the big international frame of this piece on perpetual peace. So I figured, at the time, I didn't think of anything else that I could write for peace, so I took it. In the new viewpoint, I went to the text, and there was freedom, yes, though there's only 4 or 5 places where the word is used. There's ratzon, also, but not used too much. That carried the determinism problem and the free will problem, which Chazal are relevant to this. Chazal, with the founding fathers, it was relevant to the document. They were talking about freedom, justice, and peace. I call it shalom. Lo and behold, when you look at the end of the text of the biblical thing, from the point of view of these fundamental concepts in the form of performatives, in the form of relation to life energy, shalom is the most important and the most comprehensive. Shalom interrelates with all the other concepts. Shalom here doesn't mean no war. It means fullness. It means completion. It means the interface, interaction of all different dimensions. It's what we call completeness or harmony or whatever. But it doesn't mean exclusively no war. So it means peace. Yes, it means peace. But that's the minor view. And when I started writing up the picture, there were 3 pages on freedom, 4 or 5 pages on justice, a little more about wrongdoing, on righteousness, and so on, tzedek, and use the thing, and 20 pages on shalom. And use the word shalom for the reader, even though it's addressed to the English reader, because it's so different. I mean, it's so rich, and it linked up with all of the different other pieces in the text. So, by entering the text from an anthropological point of view, what turned out was a beautiful 30, 40 page piece on freedom, justice, and shalom. Okay. What happened to Stark Right? The problem left over is the problem of, are we still with Spinoza? And Joe Levinson saying, look, I'm stuck. I can't give a rational explanation. Nobody has either. Fine, but me is me. I wanted to put them once and for all out completely. Okay. So it turned out, without the details for tonight, some other time we'll have a full session on that if you want, on the Spinoza issue. It turned out that when you enter the text from the point of view of shalom as a performative, what we're talking about are networks of performatives. When I say I am a Torah person, okay, and that's a performative, that has implications for the way I look at myself in the performative and the way I look at other people, the way I relate. So each performative of each individual person is embedded, shall we say, or allows to emerge a network of interconnections that involve people, what they're doing, and everything else. In other words, each person in effect makes a world of interconnected functions and things from the chalos that he puts on himself. When you articulate and work that whole thing out, it turns out that the whole focus on by convention fades out because there's no opposition. Convention takes its meaning because it's the opposite of by nature. So both disappear from the anthropological entry into the text. There's not talking about nature. There's nothing to do with by nature and by convention. We're talking about how do we enter a society to understand. Okay? How do we enter? And Zach sent me a piece by Levi Strauss, and so good, beautiful. I read it. I did Levi-Strauss a number of years, but again, when you do somebody and you study and you're not focused on a problem that was powerful, it didn't make the impact that even this little piece made. When I read it, 10 pages, whatever it was. You know. And Levi-Strauss, I considered at that time, he's the dean of anthropology, goes without saying. And by putting together a dugma, by an anthropology, Levi-Strauss capacity, and the Pedersen picture of the ancient Israeli world, one came out, like I came out, with a fantastic piece on liberty, justice, and shalom, as understood by Moshe, not by the prophets. They didn't do the homework, so they didn't have the distinction. I did the homework, so I say it's by Moshe. It's Moshe's conception of these things. When it came to the prophetic period, that was changed and altered and structured in a different way with a different set of chalosim. We're coming into the idea of king, melech haolam. It doesn't exist in the world of Moshe Rabbeinu. The idea of melech as a performative and as formulating a net of interconnected functions doesn't exist in the thing. There's no such thing. And the piece that we just read about Malachim and Devarim, so the consensus is that he was talking about the kings of the time, and he made some parallels. There were kingships. Paro was a kingship. Babylonia was a kingship. There were kings in Canaan. And so it wasn't, you get the wrong impression sometimes to think that the nomadic Hebrews, agricultural society and so forth, was really, had no knowledge whatsoever, no experience whatsoever with kingships. There were monarchies. They weren't as advanced in development as they were in the time of Shlomo Melech, and the whole orientation. There was a legal structure, like one of the points that's pointed out in the anthropology people. The adjudication of a law was not by a court. There was no established court system where there was court and going through and arguing the case and so on and so on. No, they were like ad hoc. Like in, they used to call that in participatory democracy. On the spot, ad hoc, all of a sudden there's a group and they start to talk and we'll take a vote and we get, what do I mean vote? Who authorized? There's no authorization. Of course there's no bureaucracy either. The evils that come in with government and so on aren't there. So this was not in the big, so when you take an anthropological approach, you come up with this view, which in effect bypasses the whole basis of Spinoza's criticism. So in that sense, what comes out of this orientation is, by the way, I gave you a new understanding of the proclamation, freedom, justice, and shalom, in addition to which the first rational refutation of Spinoza, where the categories in which he was operating have been finished. You don't have to take those categories. There's a way of entering the material which has nothing to do with by nature or by convention. The reason I emphasize Levi-Strauss, because in his work he was very tuned in to the performative, exceptionally tuned in to the performative. He wrote on ancient language, ancient thought. And just like Pedersen writes, they didn't deal in logic. They dealt with associations. It's like making pictures and associating one picture with another picture, and together they form a kind of a method. The logic wasn't built on assertions. The logic was built on networks that come out of different halosim. And when one associated with another, that was a connection. That was the connection. But logic per se wasn't the big picture. And in the two books before and in the new one, discuss and define life energy in terms of 15, 16 pieces, a piece of which is the nature of language, the nature of thought, in Moshe Rabbeinu time. In other words, it's not the way we understand things in terms of a syllogism or in terms of logic. It has a different thing, and again, I stress this because, I stress the Levi-Strauss because when you have somebody who's a top anthropology person who is sensitive, very sensitive to the biblical world, though he doesn't discuss it per se. Here and there he makes a number of references, footnotes. You have an example, a dugma, an example which will help you penetrate this layer of understanding in the text. So I found it. I thank Zachary, for sending me the piece. It was very good. One of his examples over there was how to do with music, and says, well, you can't read it. He analyzed the part of The Ring from Wagner, and he says, well, you can't really read the score linearly. Well, that's what I said many times. You can't read the score linearly. Logic is linear. The other approach is, layers on top of layers. It's not linear. So he says, look, you can't understand The Ring, you can't understand the piece in linear time. Why? Because it hasn't opened with a refrain, and then in the middle it has a repeat of the refrain with certain variations, and then at the end you have a repeat again. And so unless you stand back and see the whole picture, you don't capture the music. It's developing in time. It's not like a painting on the wall where everything is there. Everything is there in front of you from the visual point of view. Of course, there's history and other things that go with it, but the basic thing is perception, is vision. Well, in music, it's temporal. It develops over time. So he makes the point of this whole thing. Now, many of the points, even I recalled, I think I sold the book. It was a great book. He wrote a book on kinship. Fantastic piece. Unbelievable piece. But as I say, at that time, I took it as, I was in the proofs business. I took it as, read it, part of my education. But what didn't do anything. Didn't sing. It didn't say anything. Now, of course, having reread it and everything, it's a fundamental thing and will help the reader understand the Pedersen book. And he does make an effort to separate off the prophets and the later Israel from the early Israel, nomadic and so on. And he even though he doesn't enter as an anthropologist, and he doesn't enter from the point of view of the primacy of the performative in language, nevertheless, if you read the material, you see that he sort of grasped the thing. I never understood, still don't, why he's not popular again. They reprinted the book, which means there was some call for the book, to get reprinted. However, I found it to be a fantastic piece. And I used it together with the, the Olivet on the hieroglyphic. That's part of the secondary Bible. I can't lend them out because you're always involved with this whole perspective. Okay, so this was the story. In other words, I used the same performative, but it took on a different meaning. Because now it was something positive that did not exist in the first set. Okay. So now, what I want to do is shift a little bit into some more personal things about how one changes orientation. How one, all of a sudden, something percolates, and over time, you have a change. Now, in teshuva, when we talk about teshuva, we often take a very narrow approach to the whole topic. But it not only involves actions, doing the mitzvot, averot, and so forth, from the Torah point of view, but it also involves change of orientation, which is a big thing. To change your orientation and have a Torah orientation is a big thing, or a non-Torah orientation, but the human being has the capacity to do that. And indeed, that's part of the whole concept of teshuva in the Torah world. It can be done. It can be done. It's not something that cannot be done. It can be achieved by human beings to change the orientation. So what do we have here? So we have this new shift based on the performative, which I showed is in the Chumash text, and so on, so on, so on, so on. And with it went a different approach to the text. First of all, I'm not concerned with life, mind, and time. I'm way beyond that. In 35 years, I refined the concept of life, mind, and time that I was struggling with at the time, and making snippets here and there. I developed it into a much richer perspective, which we're calling life energy perspective. And it dealt with the carbon and all the rest of the stuff that I'm working on. I mean, all these things. So there wasn't taking the document, entering the document from the point of view of another thing that I'm interested in. I got the solution, and I'm working all that out. What does it have to do with this publication? Nothing. This is a publication about the document. So I approached the document from the point of view of relevance. I didn't ask, is it true? Is there an underlying Torah teaching underneath the document? I approached from the point of view of a realization that for most people who live here in the country, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Yeah. Anyway, so I entered the document from the point of view of a problem, a how-to. How can we make the document relevant in the contemporary world? And I realized just from that alone, from that entry, from that orientation, nobody is interested in reading argumentation about freedom, justice, and peace as understood by the prophets. That appeals to the mind exclusively. And where is the interest? That's going to move people? Argumentation? Yes, the philosopher would be interested, the political philosopher. Very few people in politics would be interested, plays no role. And so what we have is, you're not going to convince anybody, you're not going to break the indifference to Judaism and to Jewishness and how we to define them. We're not going to break that indifference by argument, by discourse. We're going to break it in different ways. By entering, the first thing came out was, I'm not entering from the point of view of truth. I'm entering, how do we make it relevant? The American people have more respect for the Declaration of Independence, and everybody knows the phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can be an ignoramus, and if you look at the textbooks in civics, you will see, I didn't do it in the paper, you will see a much different approach, even though the concept is outworn, it has to be a human right and everything, but you'll see a much richer approach to the document of the Declaration of Independence than there is to the Israeli Proclamation of Independence. So I asked the question, everybody knows, in addition to barbecue and everything else, everybody knows, there was life, living, and the pursuit of happiness. But, Thomas Jefferson. But Israeli, it's a nothing. How are we going to break the indifference? How have we presented it? We presented it from the truth point of view. And what do most Israelis think? It was politics. Oh, this faction didn't want this, and this faction didn't want that. And so it was when we were talking about government. When something comes up in the Knesset, they argue it out and develop a thing. And there were factions. It was, how do we get a document like Mao Zedong in China? So they wrote a document, and they imitated this, they imitated that, put together the piece, and they have a document. It has a legal purpose. It officially founds the state. If the state doesn't have a document, it has no status as statehood. It needs a chalos, a document that gives it its naming. It names the state, the official name, and someone puts it on the international scene. Okay. So the first point is to realize the whole thing shifted. I said, whoa, where do we begin? We don't begin with the document. We begin with the guy in the street and say, when it says in the document, we propose this, and we do this, and we appeal, and so on and so on. Are you included in the we? What makes you stay in the country? What does it mean to you? And instead of starting with the document as a truth product, right, we're going to start with the relationship of the document to the people. And pull together. We're going to write a textbook now. We're going to make a movie. We're going to do a documentary. We're going to make a piece. If, what's his name, can do it, we can do it. We can now have a special thing. Instead of having a Bible quiz only, we can build up Yom Atzma'ut in such a way that it has much more educative dimensions that will tap into the feelings of the person. Like when a guy walks out of the movie, he may be crying. That's good. He'll remember the movie. Granted, we don't expect the guy to walk around his whole life with the proclamation on his back burner. We don't expect that. However, in the time and in the education and in the development in the school, there should be plays. There should be all kinds of drawing of different expertises from different walks of life, from different people, who also would say, not from the point that they wouldn't say I'm a Torah person, they say I'm an Israeli. Well, that's a performative. That comes up in conversation all the time. I'm an Israeli. Now, what does that mean? What's the content of that performative? Meaning, what's the network? What's the network that comes out of that performative? Part of that network is how do you look at other people? How do you look at yourself? I'm an Israeli. How do you look at people who have a beard and payas? How do you look? Well, he's also Israeli. Well, no, that's not me. See, and how do you project, or how do you develop the networking of the performative that both of them have? But on analysis, it may turn out that they're using the same words, but they have different networks of performatives that are coming out of the same set of words. I am an Israeli. So I say, instead of starting with the document, the whole thing is out. And I started with relevance. And indeed, when you start with relevance, we talk about think tank, we talk about how do we get people to do things to start breaking the indifference. A hit in a music song, like over here, they have Shweki, it's part of the family, but he's a black sheep because he went for the Haredim. So the guy has a record here, and the kids love it, and the kids play it, and then your stuff with Kerry, the kids eat it up, they love it. And so that's part of the home life. I mean, it's right there all the time that he kept, and they go around singing the phrases and singing the song. I mean, that makes an impact. That breaks indifference. You can't say they're indifferent. So the whole approach shifts away from a truth approach into a meaning approach, based on the Chazal. Okay. Now the question is, since we start with a chalos, a self-referential performative, a performative on yourself, that means that you yourself, the person himself, is automatically at the center of everything. So even though you say the performative and it relates to, I am a Torah person who solved the problem, okay, it relates to how you relate to people, how you relate to your wife and children, how you have behaviors that are part of this network that's coming out of the chalos that you put on yourself. And so what we have here now, it opens up automatically the framework of starting with a chalos, opens up automatically learning what exactly is the chalos. I said, yes, it's a chalos that solved the problem. But how does it relate to everything else? How does it relate to other things? Were you a person that didn't give enough time to your family because you were so truth-oriented. Well, that's not implied, but it's part of the networking that comes out of the picture. When I looked at myself, I realized that I fell short in many, many things because I was truth-oriented. I was not sensitive enough to the bigger societal picture. In 1975, as before I came Aliyah, to me, you had to philosophize with a sword. I used to say, I philosophize with a sword. Until you lay bleeding on the floor, I didn't do the job. Namely, I can argue you with every point that you're going to raise. I already studied it. I prepared my lectures. I can tell what the student is going to say as soon as they open their mouth. Except, once out of 100, or once out of 50, a student opens his mouth, or her mouth, and says something you didn't think about. After all, they're thinking people, and they're college kids. Well, no matter what you want to say, you don't cover everything. Granted, I prepared, 6, 7, 8 hours for each lecture, and read material, and so that when a student raised the question, I knew where they're going, and you pick it up right off the bat. However, I wasn't omniscient. There were things that all of a sudden, out of the blue, I used to have to say, "Hey, what time you got?" The guy said, 10 minutes before the hour. I said, "Finished for today, I'll pick that question up next time." I couldn't answer. I could be in a situation where 10 minutes to go, I said, "Go home. We'll talk to your girlfriend, have a bite to eat, and go to your next class." Because the question was so pinpointed, on the spot, I didn't prepare. I didn't think about that. So what am I going to do? Fib my way through? Best policy. And they love you, of course. Give a student 10 minutes off from class. You're a hero. You gave up 10 minutes of your time. I said, "Go, get out of here. I'll talk about it next week." Then I went home and did homework and I learned from the experience. But this is what goes. So the truth, what I realized was that this dominance, this thing on truth, it has a history. Started in early childhood and development, and sexual development, and intellectual development, and so forth. When you start with the performative, all of a sudden it starts to round out to include personality psychology and all the way up into psychoanalysis. In other words, all the factors in the human personality will be part of that network that the Chalos is said, and it says, "I am a Torah person." And so what happens is you begin to pull together memories and factors in your stream of consciousness which start to give you, as it gave me a better picture of myself, a better picture of where I fell down, of where I have to do teshuva, change, be more consistent, be more following out the line. And since you said you gave up the truth perspective, did you really give it up or not? And the question for me was not only this general thing, that it lends itself to a lot of personal factors as fundamental. In addition, it says something about yourself. But 1 minute. The book that developed this in recent terms, the whole performance was built on John Austin and Wittgenstein. John Austin, I think, was 1965 or whatever the book was, and who Wittgenstein and Austin pioneered the performative. And of late is this book by Zafran and Logan on the 3 laws of performance, which build personal identity and management on the Chalos and the whole orientation that I've been talking about. When I read the book, it was a fantastic piece, and I even invited them to add me to the list to show you that what they said about CEOs and how CEOs carried over old baggage and didn't renew the situation, and then the company goes down the drain 10 years hence because they didn't probe enough deeply into these networks of personality of things, and then they have that anecdote material, and the 200 pages, half is anecdote. Oh, when I was a kid, I played ball, and blah, 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 and I found myself doing the same thing, seeing and focusing the things that I did without a memory completely. How it was on the ball field, how it was in this domain, how it was in that domain, how it was. I mean, your life is in the picture, and you see things that you weren't aware of before, and then once you see them, you can say, look, I should be more consistent, more coherent. How do I do that? Do I need professional help for this? Sometimes professional help is in order because, as everybody knows who works with profession on this, the mind and feelings of the human being is so subtle it can change night into day and day into night and sickness into health and health into sickness. I mean, so that sometimes what's needed is a professional help who has some way of relating to the person and the problems, which is not a nogea b'davar. The human being is a nogea b'davar to himself. So if you're talking about a performative that you bestow on yourself, well, maybe it's false. Maybe it's false. And so, when I, in addition to developing and writing the anecdotal dimension, and inviting Zafran and Logan to put me in as an example of intellect, of how we have intellection in terms of management of the mind, okay? And you'll find, I said you'll get a lot of readers. They'll love it, of course. They don't even read the book. But the point is, I invited them to, but the pattern, when they say, oh, when I was 12, the guy says I had this and this and this, and this carried over into this, and this carried over into this, and now, then I realized something wasn't right. Something that wasn't clicking right. And then I wasn't the smartest, he says, so I try to study everybody. Then I realized that's not going to work. I outstudied everybody, knew everything by heart, the guy says, and they still looked at me like a jerk, like a nobody. And I realized that, you have to think through everything. You can't take it for granted. Well, yeah, if you know everything. It reminds me of myself, I was in middle school printing. I was a high school kid, right? And maybe I mentioned it once. So they had the best printer. The best printer went with a job offer of 3 jobs. A job offer in New York printing houses from 18th century, which were very anti-Semitic. And I was voted the smartest in the yearbook, 90-something average. Smartest, Joe Levinson. But the 3 medals that they gave out for the best printer went to another Joe Marioni. I still remember the name. Because he wasn't Jewish. They could give a job offer. The medal they could give. Okay, if you're the smartest, you're the smartest. Like I was voted in the yearbook. But they couldn't give that thing and recommend it. Maybe I take the job. They don't know. In a vocational school, you don't go to college. Most of the kids go to work, after you graduate at 18, whatever. Okay, so they didn't know that I'm going to go to college and so on, and turn out this, all the rest. But, so they didn't give it. So I remembered, all of a sudden it came back in spades. He remembered the vision. And I said on my high school, my name is Yosef. Y-O-S-E-F. He said, wait a minute, your name is Joseph. What do you mean? No, I'm Jewish. Well, all right. I went for a job to show you different things, how certain things come out, a part of this networking. I went for a job, set up from Boston, from my professor. I went for the job, and the guy says, well, we offer faculty housing on campus. Of course, they want the faculty to participate in all the things. A beautiful campus, never mind the names. And so, I said, well, I'm going to live off campus, 18 miles. They said, 18 miles from campus? You're going to drive in every morning, 18 miles? I said, yeah, there's no problem with the roads. They said, yeah, but we offer faculty housing. So I said, well, I'm a Jewish guy, and I keep the law, and I was going with a girl at the time. I said, no, look, I'm going with a girl. Maybe I'm going to get engaged and get married, and I wanted to live in a Jewish community. Well, the faces turn green, purple, and polka dots. And how did I fit into this American college from an old college with reputation and the real? It's like Smith and these old the old Radcliffe before it became part of Harvard. And so, I mean, so the thing was, so there's a place you have to learn how to live. You have to learn how to live. There's a publish or perish. You have to learn. If you enter, you have to play the game, and on the other hand, reconstruct the game, but not blow the whole thing wide open. And so, just to end for tonight, in addition to seeing all of that and realizing where I failed as a father, where I failed as a husband, coming out of this orientation, it has nothing to do with the proclamation. What does it have to do with all this? Where did all this personal stuff automatically come in, where I went to the machine, started to write, and all of a sudden come out 2 paragraphs on a personal note? Where did it all come in? Because I'm starting with the performative, which is me. And so you're immersed automatically in that network that's involved. And so, as it developed, I asked myself the question, am I really a Torah person who solved the problem or not? What do I really mean? Well, I published these books where I wrote this up 2 years ago. But they weren't put on the market for the public. Why? Because I feared the reaction. When somebody's coming along and saying and showing in material that the Chumash can be understood in a non-theistic way, well, something in me said, it doesn't feel right. I grew up all my life as a Torah person, as a mitzvah person. Something doesn't feel right. That feeling persisted. And I then opened up the question, what's wrong? Why don't you feel right? Why don't you feel right? And upon analysis, I realized that even at this age, after all the years of work, all the years of study, I asked myself, why didn't I put out these books for the public? If you're a leader, you're not the leader, but you're certainly one of the people talking Torah, relating to students, so a small group, but you're not a zero. So as a leader, that's a leader. Being afraid. In life, you got to take risks. So suppose people don't like it. And suppose the rabbinate doesn't like it. And all my fantasy went up and said, they could do something, they come in the door and shoot you down. We're living in a crazy world. How could a guy come along with so much insight on the material? And remember, I'm a halacha person, so that makes it worse. How could he come along and say all these things? We'll shoot him down. So they can shoot you down. That's not leadership. Leadership means you got to take a chance. You got to take a risk. And so I decided, after 2 years, and they're inside in the bedroom, to put them online and see what emerges before I go to the next world, to be a slave to curiosity, and say it would be nice to know at least how the thing is beginning. You're not going to know the future. You're not going to know 50 years hence. Because 50 years hence could be a change, a shift in certain things. All of a sudden, somebody can come up and say, look, I discovered this book, it's fantastic. We've got to rebuild the Torah system for Atchal Tegula, blah, 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 blah. As I said, the only place that ordered the book was Harvard University Library. Not because they read it, because I was an alumnus, so I figured, let's buy the book. Okay, so as soon as the books came out, I put them online. The next day I got an order from the library to buy the book. Okay, but to come back and end for tonight, in addition to all these fantastic insights that came from the person, from the Chalos, and the network. What's interesting is that you should keep in mind is this is a kind of a network, interrelation of things that have like threads that are not we would call logically implied, but threads that are forming a web, forming a network. And the key concept here is a self-referential, performative functioning in a network. In the content of that network is society and the human being and the person in it. So, I ask the question, since in this piece what emerged, and I say emerge because one of the big points that was pointed out in this book on management is that when you redo the current situation and not rely on past things, but redo it, there's little predictability. There's risk, and there's possibility of failure. But unless you take the chance, you may not succeed. So there's not predictability. We're not talking about the security that comes from predictability, of using the past not to make the same mistakes. No. There is emergence. I threw the concept out when I did Bergson, who wrote on creative evolution. I threw the concept out 45 years ago as saying it has no philosophical viability. Causality, rationality, logic, structuration, emergence. Well, what do you mean emergence? As if from nowhere. Lo and behold, when you take this approach, things emerge. And here's one of the things that emerged. And one of the things that emerged to end for tonight is, I asked myself the question, why did I include this piece, the old piece, in the book? Well, at that time, I just came from the United States, Oleh Chadash. You're a philosophy person. Well, who are you? Never heard of you. Never published, never did anything. So part of it was in the context of saying, well, I'm not nobody. I mean, I'm not a garbage collector. But I didn't publish, whatever the reason. I wasn't good enough, whatever the reason. But the point is, I'm one of you guys. I'm part of academia. Okay. So it emerged. I had to learn the hard way. And then I realized that academia is not the measure. But in any event, I was part of that whole thing. Because I asked myself, why did I write about Descartes? Why did I write about Spinoza? I didn't have to take Spinoza as the model. I could have taken other biblical critics. Why did I take these things? Because I wanted to show the reader, oh, well, this guy's not a dope. You may not know anything about Descartes, but he wrote a big piece of Chiddush on Descartes. Which means that in the Descartes literature, in a course on Descartes, there'll be a little reference to Joe Levinson, who wrote a refutation of Descartes, or a piece of... So I asked myself about Spinoza. What emerged from this work was a new refutation of Spinoza on rational grounds. I destroyed the basis of the argument. And I asked myself the question, isn't that what you really want? Aren't you really a philosopher? In the heart, in the guts, in the kishkas, at root. Is what you said true? I'm a Torah person who solved the problem? Or am I a philosopher? And I left and I remained with an ambivalence till this moment of not knowing for sure, can't say for sure that I am positive in my heart that I'm an Avas Torah, even though I differ from most people, stand alone on the teachings. However, there's something inside which feeds into or gives chizuk, strengthens that performative. And on the other hand, there's something in me that says, oh, what a blessing to be a philosopher and be read for 400 years after. That's a fantastic thing. That's an immortality. That's a fantastic thing. In every book and course on Spinoza, from now on, there will be a reference to the article and a reprint for students to see, here's a rational refutation of Spinoza that stands independently of the Jewish issue. Any Jew, he's all finished. It's all over. What plagued Jews for 300 years on the Spinoza issue is all finished. It's all done, and it emerged as part of the development of this performative. And I still today stand with an ambivalence and really ask, is it the case that I'm a philosopher or a Torah person? You should know, this is not a new thing. In the early beginnings of this whole thing, at least 50 years ago, I put myself on trial. I took all the dinim in the Rambam of Epicurus, Min, Kofar, Kofar Be'ikr, all these 5-6 categories of people who deny. And I took the Rambam, Amaretz. What do I know about halacha? What do I know about how to deal with the halacha? Nothing. But the Rambam was in English, right? You could read it in English. And I took the heading, Hilchot this, Hilchot that, and I put myself on trial. Am I a Jew or a man? This goes back 50 years. And I concluded then, naive, Amaretz, knowing nothing, lack of sophistication in Torah, and even in philosophy. How much did you know? 35 years is a long time to study. And I concluded at the time, no, I am not a philosopher, I am a Torah person. I am a Torah person and not philosophy. I'm a Jew, not a philosopher. Okay, now, that could have been wishful thinking, but at that time that's what the answer was. But today, there's an ambivalence in the answer, which says, I really can't say honestly, with full integrity. With partial integrity, absolutely. Goes without saying. But with full integrity, I cannot honestly say which gives more pleasure, which gives more recognition. You say, well, you shouldn't be concerned with recognition. That's not true. I am concerned with recognition. A human being that works a full lifetime on a problem and solves the problem wants to get recognized for the problem. Okay, now the question is, how do you want the recognition? What does it mean? Now we're in another ballgame. But to say blanket, you're not concerned with recognition, that's not me. I'd like the history of philosophy to say, well, this guy did it. He was doing something else, but in the process he refuted Spinoza. Or, what I really want, but really is a word, to say, this guy's part of the Jewish tradition. This guy's part of the theological working out of Torah. He saw the mistakes, he saw the fallacies, he saw the inadequacies, and he developed a different line, which, when you stand back, has a big place for halacha, as you all know. I put it in a big place. But it remains ambivalent when it comes to indications of that network with people, with human beings, with children, with family, with wife, with friends, with colleagues, students. And so I end with an ambivalence on the actual performative that was the function and focus of attention on this second half entry into the document. What I try to show tonight was, first, the power for intellect, for how we understand something. Remember, this is a document from 65 years ago, and for Kal V'chomer, relating to other documents. That the human being as a person, meaning that ki chalosin in the person, ki performative and all the network, it plays a role in what you say, in how you write. When I went to school, they said, wow, who cares about what you are? Who cares what you did when you were a child? That has to enter the picture? Give us the argument. What's the argument? That was me. What's the argument? Stop the baloney. Why do you give me a whole story? And then I asked, just recently, and after Zachary gave me the article, I noticed, where did this style come from? What do you mean I have to exclude myself? Why can't I, in the middle, all of a sudden, talk about myself and make a point and go on? Why am I boxed in? Then I noticed, and I recalled, that when Levi Strauss wrote, it's more anecdotal. It's more on this flowing style than a typical academic paper. And why? Well, at the moment, that made a point. That was him analyzing the culture. So he didn't have to say, he started to write a sentence and he stopped it. I can't write this because it's personal. That's what I said in 1975. Who cares about you? Who cares about you? You write the arguments, not the person. But now, from a whole different entry, what emerged was a primacy of the person. It's you who are part of the thing. You are part of the approach. How you enter and how you look and how you read and how you do intellectual things is you, is part of you. And it's not an isolated thing, it's embedded in this whole picture.